Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor, I have to say, to broadcast this show every weekend since 2004. We've literally been on the air for 20 years now, every weekend, trying to provide you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. And this is a particularly interesting week in Mexican history. This weekend, I think we're all kind of well, there's, as you know, there's a lot of expectations in terms of what's going to happen to all these reforms, constitutional reforms that President Manuel Lopez Obrador been has been pushing through Congress and through the Senate, even though he is literally 3 weeks away from no longer being president. As you know, on October 1st, the next president of Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum will be sworn in. And as we speak, the Mexican Senate is debating what could potentially become one of the most important and earth-shattering reforms that could define Mexico's political system for the next for the next decade. And of course, as we try to understand what these reforms mean, particularly the judicial reform, which the president has been promoting, pushing, pressuring to pass before he leaves office. This reform includes the possibility of most judges, federal judges in Mexico, be selected or be have to face an election. They would be, like a politician, like someone who wants to be president or who wants to be mayor. They would also have to face an election process. There also there's questions in terms of whether there's change or important change in terms of the requirements behind those who will those who would be the potential candidates. There's a lot of questions in terms of what does this process look like, and how do you vote for judges? And of course, you can look to the United States or other countries, but there is a big difference. Of course, judges or those parts of the United States where you do elect judges, you're talking about local judges. Here, this reform would involve federal judges, including justices of the Supreme Court, and eventually the reform also would is kind of pressuring the states to do have the same process for local judges, for state judges. Anyway, that's one of the reforms. The other reforms has to do with what they're called autonomous agencies or institutions that have played the role of checks and balances for different functions of the Mexican government. Anyway, that is what's being debated, and there's other reforms there. But the big question mark is, regardless of whether it's approved, some of these reforms are approved next Wednesday. What does this mean for Mexico and Mexico's economy, Mexico's finance, and the possibility of Mexico's development in the long term? Joining us today is Juan Carlos Baker. You know him well. He was Deputy Secretary of Economy. He was the person in charge of negotiating or participating in the negotiations or oversaw the negotiations of the USMCA, the most important commercial agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Juan Carlos, welcome to the show. I've had the opportunity throughout the week to listen to you in different conferences and different events. A lot of people are seeking you to get your opinion in terms of the potential impact this could have on Mexico's, uh, particularly the USMCA. So, welcome to the show. Just could you just give us initial reactions as to why the international community, including U.S. legislators, NGOs, the U.S. government, it was the preoccupation was expressed by the U.S. ambassador in terms of these reforms. Why is there so much concern? Welcome to the show.
Ana Maria, thank you for having me. A pleasure, as always, and congratulations on that 20th anniversary of being constantly on air. I know that you have informed countless generations of Mexicans and Americans and other wise people interested in the relationship, and many many years to come, hopefully, will also be just ahead of us. Uh, well, several things to unpack on what you just described, but I guess that the basic point that is making everyone nervous is that maybe during the time that AMLO was president, the investors and people doing business in Mexico were somehow reassured that Mexico was still a place where business could be conducted under certain rules, and that certainty also existed in the country, no? Unlike what happened in other places where controversial figures had been elected presidents in Latin America. And the proof of that, at least to my view, is that, for example, when the AMLO administration tried to push on reforms to change the framework applicable to the energy industry, companies doing business in Mexico in those sectors, well, they made their cases before the local courts. Okay, so in a way, that felt as an additional reassurance on the part of the Mexican business environment. All of that changed on the moment that after elections, this past general elections, the ruling party Morena had the majority in both houses, the qualified majority in both houses. As of now, well, the lower house supermajority of AMLO already approved some of those reforms. We'll get to that in a moment, I'm sure. And in the Senate, the ruling party is only one vote short of such qualified majority. What does that mean? Well, it means that they can now modify the constitution, and that's really what's making people nervous. It's not really that Claudia Sheinbaum won. I guess that markets and investors somehow had already assumed that Morena was going to win again the presidency. But the fact that now they have the qualified majorities to, basically promote uh, anything that they want, including constitutional amendments, and that is obviously a completely different new ball game, no?
Juan Carlos, what is it? I mean, I guess part of the question is trying to understand what investors are thinking, what U.S. legislators are thinking, what the U.S. government is uh, is is thinking and expressing their preoccupation in terms of this legislation. Does it only have to do with the justice reform? Is there any possibility that if certain changes were done to this reform, if not right now, later on, would quieten or would reduce the anxiety in terms of of these reforms and the impact they could have on U.S. investment, on the U.S. bilateral relationship?
No, I don't think so. And just for the sake of just remembering what this is all about, those reforms, as they are, sort of generically referred to, are 20 reforms, 20 amendments that President Lopez Obrador sent to Congress back in February 2024. Now, of those 18 of those 20 are constitutional reforms, and the other two are, well, just amendments to other laws, other legislations that really are probably not so worrisome. But those 18 um, constitutional reforms are the core of the preoccupations. Now, I guess that in those 20, there are some that have to do with agricultural trade. Others have to do with energy. Others have to do with mining and water. So it's different, right? And for several different industries, there are different impacts. Uh, but I guess that the one that really has gotten most of the attention, and the one that really I just don't see how it could be sort of degraded so as to be acceptable, is the judicial reform. Because what the judicial reform does is that it horizontally touches upon the very core of how justice is issued in Mexico. So even if the others, and I don't know, energy, uh, agricultural trade, and others can be somehow probably, made acceptable or at least less concerning, the one that I just don't see how it could be put on those terms is the judicial reform, because that one, as I said, is horizontally in nature.
Joining us today is Juan Carlos Baker. You know him well if you've been following this show throughout the years. You, Juan Carlos, I remember you used to join us when you were part of the Mexican government and you were participating in the negotiation of the USMCA. And I remember asking you different aspects of the negotiation and different demands were being made by the U.S. government at the time, and the Canadian government, because we have to remind our audience that the USMCA is an agreement that includes Canada, the United States, and Mexico. During those negotiations, was there any that you can recall? Was there any articles or any discussions taking place that could kind of anticipate this types of situations where you have a where you had a president? It could be the U.S. president or the Mexican president. I mean, it does not. This problem is also can be an issue in the United States, demanding these types of reforms. In this case, the Mexican government is demanding this constitutional reforms that would have a major impact on the tone or the objectives of of this agreement of the USMCA. I mean, a country has the right to make to do they have has a right to reform their constitution. It may go against the tone or the interest of the United States, but I mean, that's the argument of the U.S. government, of the Mexican government. So
Yes.
there's not much that can be done, right?
Well, no, that's a very good point, Ana Maria, and I've heard that, from several actors, when defending why these amendments or why these proposals should not be seen as going counter the USMCA commitments. That argument of the sovereignty that Mexico has on its regulations, laws, and so on, it's always pull that card now. And let me just put it like this. Obviously, no country is going to give up on its ability to um, to modify its legislation. That is just a sovereign right, and you are not going to find any article or any treaty that specifically states that a country gives up on its right to do so. However, in my point of view, at least, pulling the sovereignty card is tricky, if not misleading, for two reasons. One, uh, yes, you are as a country allowed, obviously, to modify its own legislation, but you cannot modify it in a way that goes counter the commitments that you willingly undertook. I mean, if you no longer want to have those commitments, well, you can just leave the agreement. That is perhaps one of the most rational things to say. It's like any other contract, even a marriage. You are there willingly, and you willingly submit yourself, bind yourself to certain obligations. On the moment that you don't want those obligations, then, well, contracts can always be ended or declared void. But what it's very difficult for me to understand is how it seems that the position is that we want to benefit from everything that the USMCA brings. That is, certainty, investments. In a way, even the branding, the being part of the USMCA means something out there, right? Uh, but when it comes on, behaving or keeping up with the spirit of the agreement, well, that's when some commitments can be seen as elective from this government, and that is just not the case. That's point number one. Now, point number two, clearly, and this is another argument that I've heard several times, right? That the USMCA does not say anything about the judicial power or about the way that justice is issued in Mexico. And that is also, again, technically true. If you open up the USMCA text, you're not going to find a chapter that says, on justice, article whatever. But throughout the text of the agreement, whether that is energy, if it's competition, if it's autonomous bodies, what have you, throughout the entire agreement, there is this assumption that the commitments will be kept and enforced by authorities that are, independent, that have jurisdiction over these issues, that there will be a clear distinction so as not to have any conflict of interest, so on and so forth. The very essence of what the rule of law implies is throughout mentioned in the agreement. So you can make the argument that when these reforms, not only the judicial one, but some of the others that I also already mentioned, when those reforms are passed and enforced, well, the executive, in this case, the president of Mexico, will have so much discretionality that all of those caveats mentioned in the agreement, well, will just not be there. Yeah, I was trying to think on a different way to put it, but I just can't find any. It just won't be there, you know.
Hmm. So the issue here is, I mean, many colleagues and many analysts have been focusing on the impact this reform could have on the evaluation of the USMCA in 2026. There's a is this and whether are we confronting the possibility of this evaluation becoming a renegotiation in which the United States and Mexico could not and Canada cannot find a way to agree on continuing with USMCA? I mean, is the USMCA at risk?
Well, at risk, uh, I don't think it's at risk. Uh, I've heard and I've seen also some statements or some opinions that believe that, because of this, Mexico is going to be kicked out of the USMCA. That is, I don't believe that that is an actual possibility. Uh, but there are, and I think that you have heard me say this before, but the consequences of this, at least in my mind, I just don't see any scenario, especially given what's happened this week. I just don't see any scenario where the reforms are not going to be approved. And the president has been super adamant in saying or even giving up some possibility of amendments, changes, or the whole process to be stopped at all. So my basis scenario is that those reforms will be approved, and they will be approved regardless of what our trading partners, the US and Canada, have to say about it. So what is that going to lead us to? I think that there are two immediate, one immediate consequence and one that we will be seeing more in the 2026 review process and the way there. The most immediate consequence is that the US and Canada have already declared that this is something concerning for them, that they believe that these reforms change the level playing field with the American and Canadian companies. So I won't be surprised if the US and Canada consider starting, dispute settlement processes within the very rules of the USMCA, right? Whether that is in, I don't know, in telecommunications or in agricultural trade or what have you. I mean, there will be plenty of things in the reform that are at least debatable or at least worthy of considering launching a process against Mexico. So we could be seeing several of those processes in the next few months. That's point number one, and that will be, I believe, immediately. No, now if that happens, it won't be easy. It won't be pleasant either, uh, but it will be still within the realms of the USMCA, the institutional channel, so to speak, of the USMCA, right? And that sort of reinforces that Mexico, the US, and Canada are, binded by that agreement, and we have to abide by it. The second consequence that I see, and this is probably something that will be much more clear in the next 18 months is that on the way to the 2026 review, the US and Canada, if they wish to, in the proposals that they wish to make in that review, well, they will be even much more harder on Mexico. They will probably have a super strict stance. They will demand for maybe firmer commitments because having already witnessed all these changes and how quickly they were approved and how little to no consideration was given to trading partners, well, we cannot expect the US and Canada, for that matter, we cannot expect them to come and be super understanding and super happy with the situation. The ideas that those countries will put on the table during the review will undoubtedly be shaped by the passing of these reforms and the process that led to these reforms. Does that mean, in that process, does that mean that the USMCA is probably going to be broken? Well, I don't think so. But again, it's something that will make the review process much more complicated. And again, we can only guess what Mexico's position will be in 2 years from now, after having these reforms, the US and Canada expressing their unhappiness, so to speak, with the process, and then any reaction that the Mexican government will have to those stands. I hope that we're not at the beginning of a sort of downward spiral on which distrust only grows between the North American partners, and we sort of try to create the conditions that makes us trust each other again. I mean, that will be really, really sad if this is the final outcome of this. Everything that we have built in North America for the past 3 decades, well, can be now put under a big question mark because of this.
But maybe that is the issue, Juan Carlos, that um, this government, Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, and possibly the next president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, don't believe in North America. And at least Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador doesn't seem concerned in terms of the consequences of not following the USMCA. These conflicts or these cases that have come up don't seem to bother him, and they just don't seem concerned in terms of the impact that it could have on Mexico's exports. In fact, the president of Manuel Lopez Obrador during the morning conference, his mañanera, he basically came out and said, well, perhaps we have to start thinking about other possibilities or like other routes, such as considering buying less products from the United States, looking for other partners. I mean, he said it in the morning press conference. So I'm getting a sense that he really does not. It doesn't bother him that there is the possibility of more cases against Mexico, and I'm not too sure what Claudia Sheinbaum thinks in regards to the USMCA. Maybe they don't want to be part of North America anymore. You know what I mean?